Story 1. I have a conservative veteran family member. He believes it is complete nonsense and not the spirit of the executive order, asserting that liberals are overreacting to make a point. When I pointed out that this administration is enforcing the takedown, he still insisted it shouldn't happen. When I asked if he would vote for the opposition in response, he said no and that he will always vote for Republicans. It is obvious I do not know where the red line is for him. He thinks Elon Musk is an idiot and believes we are getting close to his red line. Story 2. I dislike the tendency to lump figures like the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers together with statements related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. These events occurred before the civil rights movement of the 1960s. These individuals are some of the most essential Americans to ever contribute to our nation, and we are relegating them to the dustbin of history by associating them with this misguided narrative. To those who hold conservative views and join this discussion, if you are saying anything other than this is all misguided, you have been seriously misled and need to evaluate the facts surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why are we dismissing the significant and vital accomplishments of brave Americans who fought for our country? This undermines the commitment of anyone considering serving our nation, regardless of their skin color. Story 3. Questions like this are asked here every 3 hours. Let it go. Conservatives are not participating in these discussions, and no one is going to give you a real answer, let alone the one you want to hear. There will not be an influx of right-wing individuals expressing regret, because they do not care. And if they do, they are sharing their feelings in their own echo chambers, which are not present in these forums. You will likely encounter more people who already share your opinions saying, they should be ashamed of themselves, or they just need to lose something they care about. These discussions are unproductive. Story 4. I am a big, unattractive white guy from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. One of the amusing aspects of being a big white guy is that conservatives automatically assume you're one of them, and they often say the strangest things in front of you. Additionally, I'm a liberal with a group of conservative friends. Let me tell you, they're very upset about the statues being removed from Monument Avenue. Since I moved here in the 1990s, they are still vocally fighting the Civil War. When I was in high school, they still celebrated Lee Jackson King Day. All the Mosley boys would gather in the Food Lion parking lot. They would drive over to the high school in a convoy, stop in the parking lot bottleneck, play Dixie on a loudspeaker, and fly the Confederate flags high. Then our vice principal would pull them into her office, and they would complain about my free speech and it's my heritage, not hate. And as soon as they thought no one was listening, they would use racial slurs. They used to drive around off school property with little nooses hanging from their rearview mirrors. Cowards. I'm still friends with many of these guys on social media. Yes, they still regurgitate all the same racist beliefs they used to. They haven't changed. They're deeply entrenched in the idea that their ancestors were victims. They continue to fight that fight. I know for a fact that many of them see Donald Trump and Project 2025 as a resurgence of the South. In my opinion, the monuments along Monument Avenue should be replaced with monuments to Otterus, the 1994 Richmond Braves, Tank Boy, and Dirt Woman. Forget what you've heard. Story 5. This anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion sentiment is a distraction. Trump can capture a segment of the nation's consciousness by engaging in this behavior. However, history remains history, regardless of its presence on an official website. It may be temporarily erased, but it can be reinstated. This situation is being used as a tool to distract people, directing their energy towards a non-issue that was not present a few months ago. Divide and conquer has always been his strategy. Keeping people occupied with this battlefront prevents them from addressing another front that is more crucial to his objectives. If half of America focused on just one issue at a time, we could effectively counter his assault on the Constitution. Instead, we are preoccupied with smaller battles that drain our energy, time, and resources. We need to become more organized and recognize what he is doing, becoming smarter in our approach. This will enable us to be more effective in countering his agenda. Focusing the American public has not been our strong suit. Story 6. I believe the blanket use of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a term to describe people like the Navajo Code Talkers will only result in more confusion about what diversity, equity, and inclusion actually means, which immensely benefits the current administration. The Code Talkers were not related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They were related to the Navajo culture. They were not enlisted for the sake of inclusion or equality. It is very dangerous to mix definitions in this context. Make no mistake, the current administration and its supporters are using a new variant of the term diversity, equity, and inclusion that simply means not white and male. Story 7. If you are trying to expose the hypocrisy and double standards, do not bother. This will not change anyone's mind. It is a cult. Story 8. Navajo Code Talkers are not related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are Native Americans who served the country. In fact, their Native American identity is what made them particularly valuable. Story 9. Code Talkers are vital. They literally won the Pacific Theater for the United States because no one could crack the code of speaking in their native language. Where can you find a group of white Americans who know a language so obscure and disconnected from every other language that linguists and code breakers cannot understand what they are saying? The diversity was strategically important in a significant way and serves as a prime example of why diversity in the military is a strength. Story 10. They will ask for your source. You will then provide them with 7 sources, at least 3 or 4 of which are intentionally right-leaning, a White House press briefing, and a live video of Trump stating it, and they will tell you that you're lying because it could never happen or is ridiculous, and that you must be misinterpreting something. I have spent a lot of time on this merry-go-round with family. I hope I saved you some time. Story 11. People who repeatedly ask this question on Reddit. Do you think Republicans will have an epiphany and become decent people simply because you've asked? Do you believe they will come forward and admit, I am racist and I disregard all minorities? Neither of those will happen. Story 12. It is apparent that many people are using this as an excuse for racist activity. It is very sad and foolish. I did not support the removal of Confederate statues, and I do not support this whitewashing either. History is what happened, and we all need to work on preserving the truth rather than rewriting it to please anyone. There are noble and ignoble aspects to all history. It all needs to be shown and made available to everyone. Story 13. I'm really not understanding how minorities in history are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. None of this history was due to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and much of it fought against those principles to achieve their goals, battling an enemy both abroad and domestically. That said, removing these great historical figures and events is unacceptable. Story 14. How are Navajo Code Talkers recognized in diversity, equity, and inclusion? They served in the war due to their unique skills, not for diversity initiatives. Story 15. They are individuals who choose ignorance and support harmful policies. They are a virus among humans. They not only lack empathy but are also very antisocial and project everything they do onto others. Notice how many far-right conservatives love to accuse transgender individuals and LGBTQ+ people of being pedophiles. It certainly seems that conservatives support pedophiles, given that they have allowed one to become president and filled his cabinet with groomers and molesters. Conservatives often expose everything about themselves without actually saying anything meaningful. Consider all the things they like to blame Democrats for. More than likely, that is what Republicans are doing behind closed doors around the clock. People often claim that issues aren't black and white, but they are. They're simply relabeled as red and blue. Politics is merely a scale on which individuals place their moral judgments and empathy. Time, history, and psychology provide ample evidence for this, and the reason they consistently deny science is that they know the truth. Often they are aware of their own lack of empathy, which is a key root of many narcissistic and sociopathic disorders. I have been friends with many conservatives throughout my life, and every single one has either turned out to be racist, alcoholic, a porn addict, or homophobic. Politics is simply right versus wrong, good versus evil, truth versus lies, freedom versus oppression. I am tired of people acting as if this isn't the case. Story 16. I'm conservative, and it makes no sense to me why we have statues of Confederate leaders. Why are we celebrating failure? Story 17. Why do you post this content on Reddit? There aren't any people who can answer this question in this subreddit. Story 18. I am a conservative and I'm not in favor of this. I thought the removal of the Confederate statues was unwise, but so is this. Are either of these things a top priority for me? No, not really. Story 19. I have expressed this opinion before and know that some people dislike it, but I will share it once more. Removing statues of General Lee was a mistake, and the left would have been wise to embrace him, not erase him. Following the war, Lee advocated for former Confederate soldiers to destroy their uniforms and pledge allegiance to the United States. He argued in many letters to former soldiers that the war was over, and now it was time to forgive and build a better country. At one point, he chastised former soldiers for wearing their Confederate uniforms in a parade. In one letter, he wrote the following: I think it wiser not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered. If your goal is to convince modern-day Confederates to give up those beliefs, you are unlikely to convince them of anything but a former leader that they respect might. This is where I believe it was a mistake to erase Lee. Rather, his post-war messages of loyalty to the Union should have been amplified. Story 20. He's not even removing diversity, equity, and inclusion content. He's removing all non-white content, even some white content with unusual names. It's all laziness, too, just AI-accelerated recklessness. Story 21. There is no diversity, equity, and inclusion-related historical context. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a new concept. However, the removal of historical context simply because it is disliked is inappropriate. Story 22. I don't think history should be erased, but not everything needs a monument. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. should have a statue, and Rosa Parks should have a statue, while George Floyd should not. Story 23. AskReddit posts like this one exhaust me. They are written as if conservatives are going to jump out and say, because I'm a huge jerk. That's why. Come on. These posts come off as insincere. Story 24. Expecting consistency from conservatives at this point is a fruitless effort. The vast majority do not care at all. Story 25. In my opinion, this is leftists in government intentionally misconstruing the order and taking it far beyond its intent in order to turn people against it. For example, Trump, new policy, no diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations in federal hiring and retention practices. Leftist bureaucrat. Understood. We will remove everything that mentions the existence of diversity. Black people no longer exist. Trump. But that's not what I ordered. Leftist bureaucrat. Look what Trump is doing. Deletes Tuskegee Airmen article. To be clear, I oppose both. I believe the Confederacy is an important part of our history, as are the Navajo Code Talkers and Tuskegee Airmen. However, I do not believe that deleting pages and such is something Trump ordered. My understanding is that his order was along the lines of hiring and employment reviews must be race and gender blind going forward. Story 26. You are speaking into an echo chamber. Conservatives won't respond because they do not want to face criticism and be downvoted. Story 27. These are not diversity, equity, and inclusion-related removals. These were highly qualified individuals who stood out on their own merits and just happened to be people of color or women. Leaders who lack qualifications feel victimized by their own incompetence, so they attempt to elevate themselves based solely on their race. It is disappointing that you accepted this absurd framing. Story 28. It was disappointing when they removed the statues, and it is concerning that they are taking down diversity, equity, and inclusion-related content from government websites. Story 29. I don't like removing anything from our history. If it's a blemish on America, we shouldn't tear it down. Instead, we should explain why it was wrong or add to the site. I don't feel that a statue glorifies any particular thing because I can look at a Navajo Code Talker statue and understand their importance. Just as I could see a Confederate general statue and recognize their role on the wrong side of history. The story of the Confederacy happened. It's in the past, and we can find ways to use it educationally to demonstrate why that direction is not one we should desire to pursue. Story 30. They love it. It was never about history. It was about letting certain people know their place. I listened to a man from Texas argue with himself while trying to defend Robert E. Lee, claiming he wasn't that bad and was just fighting for his home. I tried to explain to him that he was fighting to enslave people like him, but it did not resonate. The denial runs deep in the South. Story 31. I am a conservative, but I have never had a solid stance on the Confederate statues. I do not like the idea of individuals like that being revered in public, but it is still history. If I had to decide, I would say to make a museum for the statues but not to destroy them because that is denying history. I have not kept up with the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, but anything that denies history is a bad thing. I feel like posts like this assume all conservatives are evil and awful people and look at politicians like Donald Trump as if he were a god. He is a politician and a person like anyone else. Yes, I voted for him and I agree with a lot of what he stands for, but that does not mean I will always agree with everything he does. I do not think there is a politician who exists with whom you can agree on every single issue. What is the point of these posts? Story 32. I believe removing history, whether good or bad, is not a wise choice. Taking down Confederate statues, despite the fact that some of those individuals also contributed positively after the war for the entire country, is regrettable. Likewise, removing the Navajo Code Talkers and other significant aspects of history is also not acceptable. Story 33. You need to be respectful when speaking in their spaces on Reddit. Why do you think they would participate here if they cannot remove opposing viewpoints from the conversation? Story 34. I don't like it. I want history to remain visible for everyone in all forms, or else we can never appreciate or learn from it. History is also essential in understanding global politics. To clarify, conservatism is not a cult. We do not all think alike and agree on the same things simply because the president declares it. Story 35. Perhaps an unpopular opinion, but you will never successfully expose these individuals for their hypocrisy. They do not adhere to any beliefs except, we are good, you are bad. Before diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, it was critical race theory and wokeness. They used these terms to signify the great replacement theory associated with neo-Nazism. Nonetheless, it is beneficial to call out their hypocrisy, as some people may recognize it, and there may be a few principled conservatives who could be swayed by a logical argument. However, actual Trump supporters are aware of their hypocrisy and do not care. Any argument they present will quickly be abandoned for another when necessary. They understand that we are good, you are bad is not a popular stance, so they create a smokescreen. However, it is a very flimsy disguise, and they are indifferent to the nature of that smokescreen. Story 36. Fun fact. The Confederate monuments and statues were all erected during the 1960s and 1970s civil rights era as a response to reinforce racism and segregation during the dismantling of Jim Crow laws. As you can imagine, religious conservatives staunchly opposed racial integration and equality, so they expressed this by propping up key figures who advocated for slavery. To this day, it is not about honoring our history so much as it is about honoring a racist and prejudicial ideology that seeks to segregate and dehumanize individuals who are viewed unfavorably. Consequently, religious conservatives have no problem removing monuments of any non-white, non-European, non-heterosexual, non-Christian individuals who are true heroes. Story 37. No self-respecting conservative supports MAGA. The answer is that any real conservative is confused and outraged, while those lacking integrity are pleased with the current situation. Story 38. These are not diversity, equity, and inclusion related simply because they involve people from a minority group. Stop conflating these concepts. The Navajo Code Talkers, Tuskegee Airmen, and the Buffalo Soldiers are all integral parts of our history, and their importance is equally related to their impact on America. Story 39. So you ask a question of conservatives, and the top responses are not from conservatives. This should be a sign to you that you live in a bubble, not us. Story 40. Disclaimer. I am not conservative. However, I believe that history is history, regardless of whether it is shameful or something to be proud of. We should not whitewash it by removing the negative aspects or covering them up, nor from a cultural or racial standpoint. Story 41. Conservatives do not care about right versus wrong. They only care about us versus them and laws that can be exploited to win. The intelligent individuals may not express this, but the less informed ones do. Story 42. Everyone has gone off topic with their responses. It's a great question. Are conservatives upset by the removal of websites recognizing the extraordinary service of women and minorities? These are prior diversity, equity, and inclusion recognitions. Story 43. They are not going to answer this. They are cowards who will only speak in their safe spaces. Story 44. I'm not one of those people, but from what I gather from Make America Great Again supporters, it is a clear overreaction to push the advancing progressive lines back to what they perceive as middle ground. Story 45. Follow-up question. If we receive any conservative viewpoints, which word do you oppose and why? Diversity, equity, inclusion. Story 46. I am against removing any part of our history. That is what makes this country the greatest in the world and why millions of people want to come here. Story 47. I didn't oppose removing statues of Confederate leaders. I've always thought it was unwise to have them. However, I strongly opposed how they were removed. We should have decided as a society that their statues were inappropriate and officially replaced them. Instead, we allowed vandals to take the law into their own hands and destroy what they disliked while the police watched. At least web pages are easily restored once the former president leaves office. Story 48. The statues represent revisionist history that lacks legitimate historical context. They were erected long after the events they depict, funded by a private organization that promotes a narrative favorable to the group that lost the Civil War. Story 49. Just let it go. They are hypocritical cowards who do not care about anyone besides themselves. Their most prominent leaders are engaging in harmful behavior and they do not care. Story 50. We need to stop labeling everything as diversity, equity, and inclusion related. Let's call a spade a spade. They are removing anything that refers to or includes individuals who are not straight white males. A section highlighting notable women at Arlington Cemetery is gone. Teaching children about innovations and contributions by Black Americans is gone. Navajo Code Talkers are gone. Even archival photos and documents about the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first nuclear bomb used in war, are gone for containing the word gay. The plane was named after the pilot's mother. This is a literal whitewashing and an attempt at changing history. Story 51. Conservatives do not mind being second-class citizens as long as they believe a third class of citizens below them exists. Story 52. If conservatives were reasonable and capable of self-reflection, then they would not remain conservatives. None of them care about appearing hypocritical if they are handed wealth and power as a result of believing them. The only fools are those who have believed in their insincere complaints intended to diminish the rights, representation, and respect of minorities. Story 53. How can you still not know what diversity, equity, and inclusion means? It is incredible. I'm not a native English speaker, and even I know what it means. Story 54. The fact that whenever a minority group is involved, the mention of diversity, equity, and inclusion reveals their beliefs about the qualifications of minorities for the positions they worked for, often harder than those who are not in the minority. Opposing diversity, equity, and inclusion is discriminatory. Story 55. What's funny is that they aren't even smart enough to realize that, using their own logic and terminology, the reason the Code Talkers and similar efforts worked was specifically because of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Being unique and removed from the greater culture is what created the value of their efforts. I wonder if there's a metaphor here. Story 56. It's erasing history about contributions made by anyone but white individuals. What America, many of us, once strived to be is being wiped away by insecure, fragile white men. Story 57. How many people here are conservative, let alone MAGA? I already know the answers from people stating what the MAGA supporters think. Story 58. I'm waiting to see if he really did, since adding diversity, equity, and inclusion to a URL would likely get it automatically removed. Story 59. All I ask is that you keep up with this long term and don't just drop it after today without following up on its progress. Story 60. I oppose the removal of any kind of history. Removing historical elements related to any race that isn't white, especially those with historical or scientific significance, is unacceptable. Such things should absolutely not be removed or hidden. However, categorizing anything that isn't white as diversity, equity, and inclusion is an insult to groups like the Navajo Code Talkers, who actually contributed to and helped the country. People are being hired solely based on their race or sexual orientation, while those with more education or skills in the field are overlooked because they do not meet the company's diversity targets. Story 61. I don't think he should. The entire order needed more specification. That is probably my main complaint so far. His orders need much more detail, particularly regarding the Doge cuts and the DEI removal. Story 62. It is disappointing. I do not support erasing history, regardless of the political party involved. There is a significant difference between opposing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and attempting to erase history. It feels like an unnecessary pendulum swing back and forth. Story 63. Let's stop calling people like the Code Talkers diversity, equity, and inclusion awards. They were genuine heroes who helped win the war. Was there racism that prevented them from receiving recognition for their contributions? Absolutely. Saying they received a diversity, equity, and inclusion award implies that they were recognized only because they were Native Americans, rather than for their deserved achievements. I understand that the intent of diversity, equity, and inclusion is to highlight individuals who have historically been overlooked for their accomplishments. However, the question is what conservatives think, and this is their perspective. Story 64. Good question. Where do the people who say you can't erase our history stand on erasing non-racist history? Story 65. It's bad. I'm conservative but do not feel represented by either party. However, history should be preserved. I believe that most people outside of the extremists think this way, despite the implications of internet echo chambers. Social media often functions as echo chambers and is arguably one of the worst things to happen to society since the introduction of chemical weapons. Story 66. Statues are meant to honor certain individuals. The Confederacy is part of the nation's history and should not be censored in history books and similar materials. Diversity, equity, and inclusion-related historical events should be documented as they pertain to history. The fact that they are associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion has no bearing on their historical significance. Therefore, removing the statues is appropriate in my opinion. Those figures should not be honored in that manner. Story 67. I value open dialogue, but in this era of algorithm-driven media, we are often trapped in echo chambers controlled by corporations whose primary goal is selling advertisements. Too often, both Republicans and Democrats refuse to acknowledge when they are wrong, prioritizing partisan battles over meaningful change. There is plenty of outrage and rhetoric, but little action that truly benefits communities. Instead of endless debate, we need real solutions and a commitment to progress. Story 68. For those trying to equate the two, do not. One represents statues while they remain in the records of history. The other involves erasing written history. Story 69. I think it depends on the degree. The Navajo Code Talkers were crucial parts of World War I and World War II and absolutely deserve commemoration for their contributions. I would support removing figures like the female carrier-based naval aviator Kara Hultgreen from any place of honor if she even has one. However, her story should not be forgotten. It simply isn't a story of military success and shouldn't be viewed as such. I presume that the Trump administration is broadly removing anything that remotely resembles diversity, equity, and inclusion-related content, and I do not think that is the best approach. I sincerely hope they reinstate anything that should not have been removed. In summary, it depends on the story or person being removed, and I am more in favor of recontextualization than total removal. That being said, I didn't even vote for Trump. Story 70. Parents voted for Trump. They think it is all unwise. Either everything gets removed or none of it represents their opinion. They have definitely been feeling regret about voting for Trump this time. Story 71. They support it because they view it as payback for their icons being taken down. It's not difficult to understand. Story 72. I am not a conservative, yet I oppose removing monuments from significant moments in history. That includes the Code Talkers. Story 73. Removal of Navajo Code Talkers? That is a malicious interpretation of executive order. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is understood as discriminatory law. I do not see how Navajo Code Talkers are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion at all. Story 74. Please do not refer to it as diversity, equity, and inclusion related. He was a black man who was awarded multiple medals for his actions. There was no special treatment. Story 75. I'm not convinced the Code Talker content is all being removed due to the end of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know it's still available on the Marine Corps site according to the Axios article. Story 76. Navajo Code Talkers should be part of any comprehensive computer science education, irrespective of any social or diversity, equity, and inclusion value. Story 77. Removing the Confederate statues involves people who do not live near the statues advocating for their removal, often resorting to violence without the authority of local governments that established the statues. This is the core issue surrounding the removal of Confederate statues. The Werfrog disregards whether local communities support the statue removal or if it is conducted by the proper government agencies, particularly if it results from a decision made by elected officials. Donald Trump is the President of the United States. He won the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. He secured his victory through the democratic process, with no one else surpassing him in voting. The Werfrog does not care whether the Code Talkers are included or excluded from any discussions, just as they do not care about the removal of Confederate statues. The only concern of the Werfrog is that a duly elected representative makes the decision. Story 78. The issue is this: Trump and others are not removing them personally. It's government workers. How do we know it's not just malicious compliance? Story 79. No one is discussing the removal of the Code Talker statues. These are false statements from someone attempting to create controversy. Story 80. Once upon a time, I was against the tearing down of Confederate monuments. I felt that attempts to do so were knee-jerk reactions from people who were out of touch and unfamiliar with the culture. They were blowing everything out of proportion, much like a bull in a china shop. Slavery, segregation, and racism were battles that our society fought long ago, and the good guys won. Slavery was abolished, which remains a sad stain on human history. Segregation ended, and I can't believe anyone ever thought that was a good idea. Racism has faded, as many people have recognized the pain endured by black individuals and other minorities and have come to understand the moral arc of the universe that trends towards greater freedom and the futility of intolerance. Society has largely moved away from those harmful beliefs. So, those monuments aren't actually celebrating Confederate soldiers or the practices of slavery and racism. The only conceivable purpose of the monuments is as an acknowledgement of history and the mistakes of the past. It's clear that we maintain these monuments as a solemn expression of virtue, dedicated to never forgetting the lows humanity has endured. Some may not realize it, but this is how we bear our scars, ensuring that no one can deny the past. By keeping the past alive, we also educate our youth and protect our future. Removing the monuments would actually make the issue of racism worse. That was my belief at the time, but I was also a naive young person raised in a sheltered environment. I grew up in a neighborhood where I never encountered racist comments directed at the black community and found it hard to believe that anyone still held racist views. As time went on, I realized that some people are still deeply racist. Some individuals become law enforcement officers and abuse their power, while others turn a blind eye. It shocked me to discover that some people believed the Confederacy were the good guys or that false claims about figures like Obama were taken seriously. It was enlightening to see the hidden prejudices emerge, and sobering to realize how much I had overlooked. Had I not had the support of thoughtful individuals growing up, I might have joined the ranks of those holding prejudiced beliefs, thinking I was in the right. While I don't identify as a conservative, I firmly believe that stripping service awards from anyone for reasons other than gross misconduct is a disgrace to the individual and to all who have received those awards. Story 81. I still consider myself a conservative in the sense of traditional values of the Founding Fathers. To some extent, I guess I would be called a classical liberal or a libertarian. I believe that Trump is not a good leader and I did not vote for him. The opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is just an excuse for certain extremist groups to emerge and express racist views. I likely will not vote Republican again for a long time, if ever. I voted Republican until Trump and even supported him in 2016. After being disappointed by him, I abandoned the Republican Party and now primarily support the Libertarian Party as a protest vote, knowing they rarely have a chance. If it makes you feel better, I live in a strongly democratic state, so my vote really doesn't matter. However, you are not going to get a genuine answer from any of the Trump supporters. You'll probably only hear from traditional conservatives like me who have left the Republican Party due to its shift toward cult-like behavior. Story 82. He didn't erase what they did or who they were. Just a spot on the internet that few ever looked at. The legend lives on. Story 83. Firstly, I am not conservative. Secondly, I have mixed feelings about removing Confederate statues. Was it a dark time for the United States? Yes. Did it happen? Yes. Should we praise those who supported slavery despite the rest of the nation? No. If anything, I support changing the plaques associated with these statues to educate about the sad and disturbing history tied to those figures rather than destroying them. Destroying historical statues is a way to put them out of sight and out of mind, which risks allowing history to repeat itself. Instead, I advocate for turning them into historical lessons. I encourage cities and recreational departments to surround these structures with donated sculptures that represent the unity of our country after overcoming the Confederacy. Plaques, murals, and sculptures can help portray that the Confederacy was a dark chapter in United States history and highlight the good that comes from triumph and unity as we work together to build a better country from our mistakes. Finally, I have concerns about associating the Navajo Code Talkers with diversity hires. They absolutely were not. I do, however, oppose some practices and ideas behind diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. People, regardless of race, creed, and color, should have equal opportunity in the United States. Full stop, no exceptions. However, it is a delicate balance to limit prejudice without blindly embracing hiring practices rooted in the same prejudiced logic. Your race, gender, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, and political opinions should not influence your conduct or career as a civil servant, nor should they be discussed or displayed on government property. As an advocate for the separation of church and state, the same principle should apply to many aspects of life, as decisions are made by individuals based on their own experiences and should not be represented in the workplace. We are all individuals with different lives and opinions. The best way to represent that is through a broad landscape of unity despite diversity, instead of showcasing individual diversity over unconditional unity. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.